Hello and welcome to Beaver Off-Road on YouTube. It's been a long summer, I've been away for a while, but I want to get back into making some videos. I've had some requests. Also, I want to get back into doing some maintenance items, different aspects of repair on the Orient Sand Reaper, which would apply for the Durex as well. But the main thing I'm going to be talking about here today is the Beaver Off-Road Walker Evans shocks, specifically the rear shock. And out of 60 sets sold, we've run into half a dozen or so machines that have had issues with the lower shock perch. That would be this area here and the lower mount. What's happened is the lower shock perch on a few machines has been contacting the axle. One way to know if that's happening is where the shock perch would line up with the axle. You'll see on the axle some of the paint has been scraped away. This condition only happens when the suspension is in full extension. And the main reason for this is we've done the best we can to develop these shocks to perform and give your machine way better quality ride than the stock unit. The stock shocks are quite a bit smaller shock. They're a gas charged shock and everything's worked really good, but it's a really close tolerance on the lower mount and the shock perch as they come stock machine. But what we found is there's been some pretty large variations in the lower mount in manufacturing, and this has been shifted different directions. What I found when you order a set of Beaver Off-Road shocks, you're supplied with the misalignment spacers, and what we've done to remedy 95% of the situation is one of the lower misalignment spacers is machined down, and we provide another washer, and what that does is inside the mount it shifts the whole shock away from the axle, and like I said, 95% of the time that's shifting it over to make sure that we have that extra clearance and the variations in the lower support mounting. But we have found, like I said, about a half a dozen or so machines where the lower mount has been so far off its normal spec that the shock has contacted the rear axle, or in a couple instances the shock wouldn't even be able to go into full extension because it would actually ride in this lower cup and ride right over top the axle. And obviously that's not ideal because that would end up damaging both the shock and the axle. So what I'm going to show you with this video today is what Beaver Off-Road's come up with is a new lower mount for the shock. We've just got these manufactured, and what we'll do is if anybody has an issue with a set of shocks that have contact with it, these will be sent to you free of charge with new misalignment spacers, and we'll get this up. So what the problem is say with this one is this is going to be how to install this lower mount. Now you can see I've already taken off the lower control arm. This can be done without taking off the upper control arm or taking the axle or the whole wheel assembly off. If jacked up and done right, I'll show you a little bit further in the video what it takes to do that. Basically all you have to do is you have to remove, to be able to get to your bolts for your wheel assembly, is you have to remove the rotor. The caliper, not the rotor, and so you can access the bolts and then take the front bolts off and you can remove the control arm. Now you could do this with it on the machine, but it would be very difficult to do. You're going to create a lot more work for yourself. I recommend that the lower control arm come off. What I've done is when it was on the machine, is when the shock was still lined up with the axle, I measured up to see how much I needed to shift that shock over. And what I've done for this was when I put this back into place and had the shock is I just used a grinder and scored through the metal on the part of the stock support that would be furthest away from the axle, and then ground that off and use this rear tab, bend it over to give me my starting point, and you can see now that's made, that'll fit right through there and bolt right into place. Then what I did is took a Sharpie and mark my points where it wants to be. I grind the pad off smooth already. And what I'll do is I'll score this, and then I'll break this tab off also, just taking a pair of channel locks or a pair of vice grips, and you can just work that metal, break it off, and then grind that edge down a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you, and this is the new brackets are going to come bent. They are 3/16. They're just slightly thicker than the stock metal. They'll come pre-drilled, all set to go. Also, it's kind of hard to see for mounting purposes. The new mount is going to be slightly narrower, and what that is going to do, that'll give you an area to weld all the way around, and then you can weld under the mount, and I'll show you further as I go along after I get this one welded up. But basically I want to explain right now how we get this set up. So once it was on the machine, I determined my area, how much area I needed to move over. I have that determined now. This will be a good mounting point. This is actually going to end up moving the whole shock over roughly about, I'm going to say about 1/4 of an inch front. The shock is still going to be straight up and down, pretty much parallel, so it's going to perform. The shocks do come with pivoting bearings, so they can be off just slightly, and it won't affect the performance of the shock at all. So what I've done is I've set this up. I've ground off that one side, I've ground the pad, I've put my marks. I'm going to get this set up, I'm going to break this tab off, and I'm going to weld this up, and I'm going to show you what it looks like after it's been welded up. The other thing is, when you get these parts, if you have a problem, what you do is you just contact me at Beaver Off-Road, and like I said, these will be shipped to you free of charge, and they're going to come primered, so you'll have to sand it down to make sure you have good contact area for your weld. They can't really be painted because you need to sand them down, so they'll just come primered. And of course, once you sand it all down, I recommend using good grease remover or oil remover. I use brake parts cleaner so we can clean the metal really well, and we'll clean this metal so we can make sure we get a really good weld. And so I'm going to get this set up. I'm going to take this other tab off now that I have it marked. We'll get this welded up, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how I weld that on there, and we'll go over what it takes to remove the control arm off the machine. Now you can see I've got the new bracket welded on. This is the piece I ground on and just took a pair of vice grips, worked it, broke it off, ground the surface flat. Recommend using blocking the lower control arm up. In this case, just a couple pieces of scrap wood. It allows you to be able to position your lower mount and be able to clamp and hold it in place if you want to. Now you can see, like I said, this the new mount is slightly narrower than the stock mount on the machine, and the purpose for that is that it gives you a good surface, good flat surface to be able to weld on each side, weld along the side here, and then once you do it, you can flip it over and it gives you a good welding surface there. So what you're doing is when you're putting on the new mount, you're basically welding around all four sides, so you don't have to worry about cracking or anything like that. I haven't got it hot enough that anything's going to be weakened or anything like that. So we're all set to go. What I'm going to do is this still has to cool a little bit. We'll put a coat of paint on it and get it all set to go. But you can see what's going to happen now is this mount is made to be, for one thing, the other mounts, this metal is kind of cheap. It's a little bit thinner. This is 3/16 steel support, so you got a little bit more support, a little thicker, and you can see the bolt still goes right through. But now what we'll be able to do is, with the new support also, if you do have an issue with this happening, and like I said, again, these will be supplied free from Beaver Off-Road for anybody that has an issue with the lower spring perch contacting the axle. These will be sent to you free. You also get 2 new misalignment spacers to replace the ones that were machined down. And with the new misalignment spacers, and I just dropped one and it took off somewhere, you can have both those and that will fit right in there right, and your mounting position will be just right, and the shock will mount right like that. So what we'll do is we'll go and get this mounted on a machine and show you how that's all going to fit and be able to demonstrate the clearances that we increased on that, and we'll give you a little more detail of what's going on here. I need to make a correction. I stated in the video that these parts and the contacting of the shock with the axle happens in full extension, and I misspoke at that time. Actually, when this happens, this condition happens, is in full compression and changes the angle with the shock at the axle. So this is just to clarify that I screwed up in the video, just because I'm not that good with videos. Now, removal of the lower control arm is pretty simple. You want to jack up the machine and support the machine and have the full system down at full extension. You will have to remove the caliper so you can remove the slides to access your lower bolts. What you're going to do is just remove this slide. You're going to remove this lower mounting bolt and the 2 bolts up against the frame. And if you have your upper control arm supported, you can remove that bolt. What you do is remove this bolt. You can let the whole lower control arm swing down. Then you can remove those bolts, and you can remove the control arm and be able to weld your mounting point on there. Now we have new. Okay, now that we have this in place, I get my misalignment spacers installed on the shock. Get my shock positioned in here. Lower bolt in. And my upper bolt. Lift it up slightly. And now, it's kind of hard to see from the camera angle, but basically, if I could take a straight edge and the shock's mounted back in, and I apologize, I stated earlier in the video that this condition happens at full extension, and after I'm looking at it, I don't know what I was thinking, but it actually happens in full compression, and that's when when the axle would come up and want to pass by the lower spring perch. Now you can see if I were to take a straight edge, I can take that straight edge and run that right along. And actually, in this, I can pass the width of that wrench between the axle and that lower perch, so I know I'm not going to have any problems with that. It's still a very tight tolerance. This is probably 1/8 inch thick on that wrench, but that's about the gap you want to achieve if you do have to go into that. So this is all set. I can bolt it all back together, and that's how you mount those the new lower support. And you can see it virtually does nothing to change the angle of the shock. That's still pretty much straight up and down 90 degrees, but it's going to give us that extra buffer there. And with the misalignment spacers and the bearings, it won't change the performance at all, and it's welded up and going to be just as strong as if not stronger, than the stock unit that was on there. So that's what's involved if you happen to have that issue with your axle rubbing on a lower perch on the Beaver off-road shocks. And I apologize if anybody has had that issue. I will state again that that part will be supplied to you free of charge along with new misalignment spacers. If you don't feel comfortable doing the welding, you can set up and mark how you want that to be, and take the whole lower control arm and lower mount and take it to someone who can do the welding for you. That can do a quality job of welding it to make sure it's going to be strong. But once you have that set up and marked, then they can weld it, and once you're on there, you should be all set to go. So that concludes the video. That's how it all gets mounted on there, and that's what it's going to take to make sure that you get the absolute best performance you can out of the Beaver Off-Road shocks. And that's what it's really all about, is just wanting to make sure my customers have the best equipment they can have, with the best service they can have, and the best ride quality they can have. So there you go. I appreciate your time. Thank you.